Did you know that one of the most frightening villains in movie history was played by a man who almost never acted in films at all? The Night of the Hunter, released in 1955, is a movie that scared audiences, confused critics, and then quietly disappeared, only to return decades later as one of the greatest American films ever made. It is a story about a lying preacher, two brave children, and the eternal battle between good and evil. Let's dive in and discover 20 weird and amazing facts about The Night of the Hunter. Number 20. The director who never directed. Again, Charles Laughton was one of the most celebrated actors in Hollywood. He had won an Academy Award. He had played unforgettable characters on screen. He was a man of enormous talent, enormous personality, and enormous confidence. So when he decided to step behind the camera and direct The Night of the Hunter in 1955, everyone expected great things, and he delivered something extraordinary. He created a film that looked unlike anything Hollywood had ever made. The lighting was haunting. The camera angles were strange and beautiful. The storytelling felt almost like a dark fairy tale, not a traditional thriller. Critics and audiences were baffled. Some people loved it deeply. Many people simply did not understand it. The film did not make the money the studio hoped for. Reviews were mixed. Some were outright cruel. Charles Laughton took it personally. He had poured everything into this project. Every frame carried his artistic fingerprints. When the film failed to connect with audiences in the way he had dreamed, something inside him broke a little. He made a quiet, painful decision. He would never direct another movie again. Not one. He returned to acting and never looked back. Decades later, filmmakers like Martin Scorsese and the Coen brothers would call The Night of the Hunter a masterpiece. Critics who once ignored it began placing it at the top of their greatest films lists. But Charles Laughton was gone by then, passing away in 1962, never knowing the full extent of the treasure he had left behind. He created one of cinema's greatest gifts and then walked away from directing forever. What looked like failure was actually a prophecy waiting to come true. Number 19. Robert Mitchum's most terrifying performance. Robert Mitchum was known for playing tough guys. He had a slow, sleepy quality to his face that could feel either calming or deeply dangerous depending on the scene. When he was cast as Reverend Harry Powell in The Night of the Hunter, he took the role and transformed it into something the world had never seen before. Reverend Powell is a false preacher who murders widows for their money. He has the word love tattooed on the knuckles of his right hand and the word hate tattooed on the knuckles of his left hand. He uses these tattoos to perform dramatic little sermons about the eternal battle between good and evil. It is chilling. It is theatrical. It is completely unforgettable. Mitchum later said in interviews that he considered Reverend Powell one of the easiest roles he had ever played. He said that he had met real men like Powell in his life, men who wore religion like a mask, men who used God's name to hide their darkness. That knowledge gave him a terrifying authenticity. He never seemed to be acting. He seemed to be remembering. His voice was low and melodic when he sang hymns, and that contrast, the sweet voice carrying evil words, made audiences shiver in their seats. Film historians later ranked Reverend Harry Powell among the greatest movie villains of all time. Yet Mitchum himself brushed it off as simple work. He said the character was just someone he understood, not just acting, something far more personal and far more frightening than that. Number 18. The famous love and hate tattoos were not original. Here is something that surprises almost everyone who hears it. The iconic love and hate tattoos on Reverend Powell's knuckles did not originate with The Night of the Hunter. They came directly from the novel written by Davis Grubb, published in 1953. Grubb based his character partly on Harry Powers, a real serial killer who was executed in West Virginia in 1932. Powers used religion and charm to lure and murder women. The character of Reverend Powell was a fictional but deeply rooted response to that real horror. Davis Grubb included the knuckle tattoos as a symbol of the hypocrisy at the heart of Powell's character, the performance of holiness hiding absolute evil. When Charles Laughton and screenwriter James Agee adapted the novel, they kept the tattoos because they understood their power immediately. On screen, those 8 letters became one of cinema's most memorable images. Countless movies, television shows, and pieces of art have referenced those tattoos since 1955. The idea entered the culture so completely that most people assume it was invented for the film. But it came from a book, and the book came from a real murderer. And a real murderer inspired a fictional monster, and a fictional monster scared millions of people across generations. One image flowing from reality into literature, into cinema, into culture. That is how powerful a single symbol can be when it carries real human darkness inside it. Number 17. James Agee's troubled screenplay. The screenplay for The Night of the Hunter was written by James Agee, one of the most respected writers in America at the time. Agee had written beautiful film criticism and had authored the Pulitzer Prize-winning book A Death in the Family. He was brilliant. He was gifted. He was also deeply troubled during the writing of this script. Agee was struggling with alcoholism and declining health when Charles Laughton hired him to adapt Davis Grubb's novel. The script he delivered was reportedly enormous, far too long to film as written. Some accounts suggest it was close to 350 pages, which would have translated to nearly 6 hours of film. That was clearly impossible. Laughton worked extensively to reshape and trim the screenplay himself, keeping what he loved and cutting what would not serve the story on screen. Agee was said to be difficult to work with during this period, and the collaboration was strained. Tragically, James Agee died of a heart attack in 1955, the same year the film was released. He never had the chance to see the finished product on screen, and he never knew that the film he helped create would eventually be celebrated as a masterpiece. Charles Laughton made enormous changes to the original script, and film historians debate how much of the final film truly reflects Agee's vision versus Laughton's. What is clear is that both men brought something essential. What looked like a smooth creative partnership was actually a difficult, painful, and ultimately incomplete collaboration. Number 16. The cinematographer who changed everything. The visual style of The Night of the Hunter is unlike almost anything else in American cinema. The images look like German expressionist paintings brought to life. Shadows fall in strange, dramatic patterns. Characters are lit from below, making them look like monsters from fairy tales. Wide shots of the river and the countryside have a dreamlike, almost unreal quality. All of this came from the mind and eye of cinematographer Stanley Cortez. Cortez was known for being extraordinarily slow and precise on set. He was a perfectionist who could spend hours setting up a single shot. This frustrated producers and drove budgets higher than planned. But Charles Laughton trusted him completely. Together, they built a visual world that had never existed in Hollywood before. Cortez drew inspiration from the silent film era, particularly the work of German directors like F.W. Murnau and Fritz Lang. He studied the way those early filmmakers used shadows and light to create fear without showing anything explicitly scary. He applied those ideas to The Night of the Hunter with stunning results. The scene where Shelley Winters' dead body sits at the bottom of the river, her hair flowing like river grass around her, is one of the most beautiful and disturbing images ever captured on film. Cortez lit it and composed it like a painting by a master. The production was slow. The shoot was difficult. Cortez's methods frustrated nearly everyone, but the images he created have lasted 70 years and counting. Slow on set, eternal on screen. Number 15. Lillian Gish and the Silent Film Connection. One of the most remarkable casting choices in The Night of the Hunter was the decision to cast Lillian Gish in the role of Rachel Cooper, the tough and tender woman who shelters the children from the evil preacher. Lillian Gish was a living legend. She had been one of the greatest stars of the silent film era, working with legendary director D.W. Griffith in films like Birth of a Nation in 1915 and Broken Blossoms in 1919. By the time The Night of the Hunter was being made, Gish was in her late 50s or early 60s and had not been a leading presence in major Hollywood films for many years. Charles Laughton cast her deliberately and thoughtfully. He understood that Lillian Gish carried something inside her that younger actresses could not replicate, a connection to the oldest traditions of American cinema, a physical expressiveness born from the silent era when actors had to communicate everything through their bodies and faces alone. Gish brought immense warmth and quiet strength to Rachel Cooper. In the climactic scene where she sits in a rocking chair on her porch, holding a shotgun and singing hymns to protect the children while the evil preacher circles outside in the darkness, she is magnificent. The contrast between her gentle voice and the loaded weapon on her lap says everything about the film's themes without a single word of explanation. Laughton knew exactly what he was doing when he hired her. Old cinema protected new cinema. That was the secret. Number 14. The Children Who Carried the Film. The heart of The Night of the Hunter beats inside two child actors, Billy Chapin, who played John, and Sally Jane Bruce, who played Pearl. These two children are on screen for enormous portions of the film, and the story rests on their shoulders in a way that would challenge even experienced adult performers. Billy Chapin was about 10 years old during filming. He had to carry fear, confusion, protectiveness, and courage across scene after scene. Sally Jane Bruce, who played his younger sister, was even younger, only around 5 or 6 years old during production. Charles Laughton had a deep love and instinctive understanding of how to work with children. He knew that directing child actors required patience, imagination, and kindness rather than technical instruction. He would tell the children stories. He would play games with them. He would create the emotional atmosphere he needed through imagination rather than direction. Sally Jane Bruce later recalled in interviews that she had no real understanding of what was happening in the story. She was simply doing what the kind man behind the camera asked her to do. And yet her performance is heartbreaking and authentic. The scene where she clutches her rag doll, which hides her father's stolen money, and faces the terrifying preacher, is genuinely affecting. Two children carried a masterpiece, and they did it almost without knowing it. Number 13. The river escape scene was filmed on a studio set. One of the most visually poetic sequences in The Night of the Hunter is the river escape. John and Pearl float down the river in a small skiff, drifting through the night while the evil preacher hunts them on horseback along the bank. The sequence is breathtaking. Fireflies glitter in the darkness. Enormous spiderwebs stretch between reeds. Frogs and owls and rabbits appear in close-up, their eyes wide and still, like quiet witnesses to the children's journey. It feels completely natural and completely magical at the same time. Almost none of it was filmed outdoors. Charles Laughton and Stanley Cortez created the entire sequence on a studio set at a place called the Pathé Studios in Hollywood. They built the riverbank. They placed animals on set. They created the spiderwebs by hand. They used lights to mimic moonlight reflecting on the water. The effect they achieved looks nothing like a studio set. It looks like a dream someone had about nature, heightened, beautiful, slightly unreal in the most wonderful way. This was intentional. Laughton did not want the sequence to look like documentary filmmaking. He wanted it to feel like a fairy tale seen through a child's frightened, wondering eyes. The most natural-looking sequence in the film was the most artificial. What looked like a river at midnight was a stage in California. That wasn't the real world. It was something better. Number 12. The film was based on a real murder case. Davis Grubb's novel, which inspired the film, was not purely fictional. It was deeply rooted in a real criminal case from West Virginia in the early 1930s. Harry Powers, whose real name was Herman Drenth, was a man who placed Lonely Hearts advertisements in newspapers to attract widows with money. He would charm these women, sometimes marry them, and then murder them along with their children to steal their savings. He killed at least 5 people, and possibly more. When he was captured and executed in 1932, the case received enormous national attention. Davis Grubb was a young boy living in West Virginia when the Powers case unfolded. The horror of it stayed with him for years. When he grew up and became a writer, he used that childhood fear as the foundation for his novel. He transformed the real killer into Reverend Harry Powell, a character who added the layer of religious hypocrisy, the performative piety, the hymn-singing horror. By placing the story through the eyes of children, Grubb captured something profound about how adults fail to protect the young from the evil that walks among them wearing friendly faces. The film preserved this truth faithfully. What felt like a dark fairy tale was actually a ghost from history. The fear was real because the monster was real. Number 11, United Artists was deeply nervous about the film. When United Artists, the studio that distributed The Night of the Hunter, first watched the finished film, the reaction inside the company was reportedly far from enthusiastic. The film was strange. It did not look like any other Hollywood picture of its era. It was darker and more expressionistic than typical studio releases. It did not fit neatly into any genre category. It was not quite a thriller. It was not quite a horror film. It was not quite a children's story, though it involved children at its center. Studio executives were uncertain how to market it. The promotional campaign they eventually created emphasized Robert Mitchum's intimidating presence and tried to sell the film as a conventional thriller. This approach may have contributed to audience confusion. People came expecting one kind of film and found something much stranger and more unsettling than they had anticipated. The box office results were disappointing. The studio's nervousness turned out to be a prophecy of commercial failure. But what the studio could not predict was that the film's strangeness was precisely its greatness. It did not fit the mold of its time because it was made for a future that had not arrived yet. Executives worried about a film that turned out to be timeless, commercial failure, cultural immortality. Sometimes those two things walk together. Number 10. The Hymn That Became a Weapon. Throughout the film, Reverend Powell sings a hymn called Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. His deep, melodic voice carries the song through many scenes, and it creates one of the film's most distinctive and disturbing effects. The hymn is a real traditional gospel song that has been sung in American churches for over a century. It is a song about finding comfort and safety in faith. In the context of The Night of the Hunter, it becomes something monstrous. Powell sings it as he hunts the children. He sings it from outside Rachel Cooper's house in the darkness, his voice drifting through the night like something diseased wearing the costume of something holy. And then Rachel Cooper, sitting on her porch with her shotgun, begins to sing it back at him from inside the house. Two voices, the same song, two completely opposite meanings, one voice carrying evil, one voice carrying protection. Charles Laughton understood that this musical duel expressed the film's entire thematic battle in a single, extended moment. The choice to use a real, beloved hymn was deliberate and brilliant. Audiences who recognized the song felt something extra, a corruption of something they had trusted and loved. Music used as armor, music used as poison. The same notes serving opposite masters. Number 9. The film was virtually lost to history. For years after its disappointing theatrical release in 1955, The Night of the Hunter largely disappeared from public view. It was not widely shown on television in the years that followed. It was not discussed in film schools or celebrated in critical circles. Not yet. For roughly 2 decades, it existed in a kind of cultural twilight. A few passionate admirers kept talking about it quietly, but the mainstream had moved on. Then, gradually, things began to change. Film critics and filmmakers who had seen the movie as children or in rare screenings began writing about it with increasing reverence. Directors who would become important figures in American cinema cited it as an influence. French critics, who had always been more willing to champion unusual American films, praised it highly. By the 1980s and 90s, the film had been fully rediscovered and reevaluated. It began appearing on lists of the greatest films ever made. Retrospective screenings drew enthusiastic audiences who were encountering it for the first time. The Criterion Collection eventually released it in a beautiful, carefully restored edition that introduced it to new generations of film lovers. A film that had been buried was now considered a treasure. What the 1950s rejected, the future reclaimed with open arms. Number 8. Charles Laughton's Unusual Rehearsal. Methods. Charles Laughton approached the directing of The Night of the Hunter with the instincts and methods of a theater actor rather than a conventional Hollywood director. He was deeply interested in the emotional truth of each scene rather than purely technical considerations. His rehearsal process was unconventional and sometimes startling for cast members who were used to more traditional direction. Laughton would often read entire passages of literature aloud to his actors before shooting a scene. Passages that had nothing to do with the script directly, but that captured the emotional atmosphere he was seeking. He might read a poem, a fairy tale, or a passage from the Bible. He wanted actors to arrive at an emotional place rather than simply follow instructions. He was also known for his patience with actors who were struggling and his impatience with technical delays. He cared deeply about human performance and would spend as much time as needed working with a performer to find the right feeling. For Robert Mitchum, this approach was not necessary. Mitchum arrived already knowing exactly who Powell was. But for younger and less experienced cast members, Laughton's method was revelatory. He made them feel rather than perform. Feeling always carries further than performance. That was his secret, and it shows in every frame. Number 7. The Forgotten Performance of Shelley Winters. Shelley Winters played Willa Harper, the widowed mother who falls under the spell of Reverend Powell and pays a devastating price for her trust. It is a performance of remarkable vulnerability and tragic submission. Winters was already a respected actress when she took this role, and she would go on to win 2 Academy Awards later in her career. But her work in The Night of the Hunter is sometimes overlooked when her career is discussed, perhaps because the film itself was forgotten for so many years. Willa Harper is not a strong character in the conventional sense. She is a woman so desperate for love and stability that she allows herself to be deceived by a monster. Winters plays her with heartbreaking honesty, never asking the audience to admire Willa, only to understand her. The scene where Willa realizes the truth about her husband too late is performed with a quiet, devastating stillness that stays with viewers long after the film ends. Laughton understood that Willa's tragedy was not stupidity, but loneliness, and Winters communicated that with her entire body. When Willa's story concludes in the river, it is one of cinema's most haunting images, and Winters made us care enough about her to feel it. An underrated performance in an underrated film. Both eventually received their proper recognition. Number 6. The budget was remarkably small. The Night of the Hunter was made on a production budget of approximately $700,000, a relatively modest figure even by the standards of 1955, when many major Hollywood productions cost several times that amount. This financial constraint shaped every creative decision made on the film. The elaborate studio-built sets for the river sequence were not an extravagance, but a budget necessity. Filming on location would have cost significantly more. The creative team had to find visual solutions that cost little, but suggested much. Stanley Cortez's use of deep shadows was aesthetically revolutionary, but it was also economical. Darkness costs nothing to film. What you cannot see does not need to be built or lit. Charles Laughton and Cortez turned financial limitation into artistic philosophy. Every shadow that falls across a character's face, every angle that distorts and unsettles, every creative decision that makes the film look the way it looks, all of it was shaped partly by the need to make something powerful with very little money. This is a lesson that generations of independent filmmakers have taken to heart since. The Night of the Hunter proved that imagination is cheaper than a big budget and infinitely more valuable. Creativity born from constraint, magic made from limitation. Number 5. The influence on later filmmakers was enormous. Despite its troubled initial reception, The Night of the Hunter cast a long and lasting shadow over American cinema. Filmmakers who grew up watching or studying the film carried its visual language and emotional power into their own work. Martin Scorsese has spoken about it with deep admiration and cited it as a formative influence on his visual thinking. The Coen brothers' film True Grit, particularly in its portrayal of children facing adult evil, carries clear echoes of the Night of the Hunter's themes. Terrence Malick's Badlands shows the influence of the film's visual poetry and its story of innocence pursued by dangerous people. David Lynch, whose films share a quality of small-town menace and dreamlike imagery, has acknowledged the film's impact. The image of the villain's silhouetted figure on horseback hunting the children across a moonlit landscape has been referenced and echoed in countless horror films and thrillers made in the decades since. A film that seemed to fail commercially became a secret classroom for some of the greatest filmmakers of the following generations. They watched it, they learned from it, they carried what they learned into their own masterpieces. One film whispered into the ears of many others. Number 4. The underwater scene required extraordinary ingenuity. The image of Willa Harper's body sitting at the bottom of the river, her long hair and dress flowing outward in the current like the petals of a strange underwater flower, is one of the most visually arresting images in the history of cinema. It is simultaneously beautiful and deeply disturbing. Achieving it required extraordinary ingenuity from Stanley Cortez and the production team. The shot was filmed in a tank of water on the studio lot. Getting the fabric of Shelley Winters' costume to flow naturally required careful testing and adjustment. The lighting had to suggest the filtered, greenish quality of river water illuminated from above by sunlight. Cortez positioned the camera at a precise angle to create the sense of depth and distance without losing the detail of Winters' hair spreading outward. Reportedly, the shot was extremely difficult to achieve and required multiple attempts before the team captured what they were looking for. The image that resulted looks as if it required enormous resources and elaborate underwater filming equipment. In reality, it was achieved in a tank with ingenuity, patience, and an extraordinary artistic eye. The most haunting image in the film was created in the most unglamorous circumstances imaginable. A tank of water, a patient crew, a perfect eye. That is how unforgettable images are made. Number 3. The film explores America's darkest spiritual anxieties. The Night of the Hunter is not simply a thriller about a murderous preacher chasing 2 children. At its deepest level, it is a meditation on one of America's most persistent and troubling realities: the ease with which evil can disguise itself in the language and appearance of religion. Reverend Powell is not a complicated psychological portrait of a disturbed individual. He is something more archetypal and more frightening than that. He is a symbol of the way that religious authority can be weaponized by people without conscience. He sings hymns, he speaks the language of God's love, he appears in communities as a holy man, and he murders. Davis Grubb understood, and Charles Laughton understood after him, that this particular kind of deception touches something deep in the American psyche. The country was built on religious traditions and genuine faith, and the corruption of those traditions by false prophets is one of its recurring nightmares. The children in the story are protected not by institutional religion or social authority, both of which fail completely, but by one old woman's private, stubborn, personal faith and her loaded shotgun. Real protection in this film does not come from systems. It comes from individuals who are willing to stand in the dark and sing. That is a truth that has never gone out of date. Number 2. Critics called it a failure, then called it a masterpiece. The critical reception of The Night of the Hunter, when it was released in 1955, was genuinely mixed and often unkind. Some reviewers found it pretentious, others found it confusing. A number of critics acknowledged Robert Mitchum's powerful performance, but were uncertain what to make of the film surrounding it. The New York Times review was polite but unenthusiastic. Other publications simply dismissed it as strange and uncommercial. No one placed it in the conversation of great American films. Not yet. Then the decades passed. Critics who had dismissed it began reconsidering. New generations of film scholars began writing about it with reverence. In the year 2000, the American Film Institute named it among the 100 greatest American films of all time. The British film magazine Sight and Sound has included it in its influential poll of the greatest films ever made across multiple decades. Film schools teach it. Cinematography students study Stanley Cortez's frames. Scholars write entire books about Charles Laughton's one directorial effort. The same film that reviewers shrugged at in 1955 is now considered a permanent and irreplaceable part of cinema's greatest achievements. The same work, completely different eyes. Critical history does not move in a straight line. Sometimes it circles back and discovers what it missed the first time. Number 1. The Night of the Hunter. Almost had a different ending. The Night of the Hunter ends with Rachel Cooper delivering the children safely to justice and reflecting quietly on the resilience of children, their ability to survive, endure, and eventually overcome the cruelties visited upon them by the adult world. It is a moment of hard-won peace rather than triumphant celebration. The tone is bittersweet and philosophical. But this ending, which now feels absolutely right and inevitable, was not the only conclusion Charles Laughton considered. During the development of the film, there were reportedly discussions about alternative approaches to the climax and resolution, approaches that would have been more conventionally satisfying and less ambiguous. Laughton eventually committed to an ending that trusted the audience to sit with something complicated rather than something neat. The final monologue, delivered by Lillian Gish in Rachel Cooper's voice, reflecting on the strength of children, gives the film a perspective that lifts it from thriller to something closer to fable. It transforms the specific story of John and Pearl into a universal statement about innocence, survival, and the fundamental decency that sometimes appears in the world to protect the most vulnerable. If Laughton had chosen a simpler ending, the film might have been easier for audiences to digest in 1955. But it would not have been the film that filmmakers and scholars and ordinary viewers have treasured for 70 years. The difficult choice was the right choice. The ending that felt strange became the ending that felt true. Bonus fact: the fairy tale that Laughton read aloud. Every morning here is something that almost no one knows about the making of The Night of the Hunter. Before filming began each day, Charles Laughton had a private ritual. He would gather members of his crew and sometimes cast members together, and he would read aloud to them from fairy tales, specifically the brothers Grimm and Hans Christian Andersen. Not as a casual gesture, not as a warm-up exercise. He did this deliberately and purposefully because he believed with absolute conviction that The Night of the Hunter was not a crime film or a thriller, but a fairy tale for adults. He wanted everyone involved in the production to carry that understanding in their bodies and in their creative instincts throughout each day's work. The fairy tale reading informed everything. It influenced the way Stanley Cortez lit the shots, the deep theatrical contrasts of light and shadow that you find in illustrated storybooks rather than realistic cinema. It influenced the way the animal cutaways during the river escape sequence were composed, each frog, each rabbit, each owl presented like an illustration on a page, watching the children pass with ancient, knowing eyes. It influenced the way Laughton directed the child actors. He spoke to them in the language of stories rather than the language of psychology or technique. He told them they were characters in a bedtime story, and that the man coming after them was the wolf from the woods, and that they must be brave like the children in the stories always are. Lillian Gish later said that Laughton's fairy tale framework was the key to understanding everything about what the film was trying to achieve. It was not asking whether this story was realistic. It was asking whether this story was true. And truth and realism are very different things. The most chilling American thriller of its era was built on a foundation of children's stories told aloud in the morning light. Old stories gave new terror. Ancient wisdom protected the frame. One man reading fairy tales changed everything about how the camera told its story. The Night of the Hunter is a film that arrived too early for its time and then waited patiently for the world to catch up. It was built by a first-time director who never directed again, lit by a cinematographer who worked like a painter, and carried on the shoulders of children who barely understood what they were making. It told a story about evil wearing the face of goodness, about innocence surviving against all odds, and about the kind of quiet courage that does not announce itself but simply sits on a porch in the dark and refuses to move. What makes this film extraordinary is not just its images, though those images are extraordinary. It is not just its performances, though those performances are unforgettable. It is the feeling it leaves behind, the sense that fairy tales exist not just for children, but for everyone who has ever needed to believe that something good will eventually stand between innocence and the darkness outside. Charles Laughton made one film. One. And that one film has lasted 70 years and will last 70 more. That is not failure. That is a kind of immortality that most directors never achieve, even with a lifetime of work. If you enjoyed these stories, subscribe for more. Every movie hides a truth, and we'll keep uncovering them, one story at a time.